Welcome to the Buck Stops here, the official audio show of NotInHallOfFame.com, and I'm your host, Kirk Buchner, the Buck, the owner and the operator of NotInHallOfFame.com and the sister sites, the fictitious Athlete Hall of Fame and the fictitious Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It's interview time here at Not in Hall of Fame, and we are taking the Starship fame all the way to Cleveland, Ohio, the home of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and Cleveland.com. Cleveland.com, if you haven't checked that out, I certainly encourage you to do so. It's not just entertainment and sports from the Northeast or East Ohio area, but they also cover the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and they should. It's a pretty big institution there, and a main draw for a lot of people to go to Cleveland. I know that I've done that at least twice. And I talked with entertainment reporter Troy Smith, and we had a great discussion about the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, the good, the bad, and pretty much the ugly. So sit back, enjoy, and hopefully enjoy the show. Troy, thank you so much for being part of the show. I'm really excited to talk to you. I almost feel like it's like two people who just met at random at a party and just happen to have the same interests.
Yeah, that's kind of what it feels like when you're in one of the people who follows the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame so closely. You feel like you know people, but you don't. But you're united by this subject matter that you're passionate about.
So where did that originate for yourself to become really passionate about the Rock Hall? I mean, now you're working for Cleveland.com, but you're from Rochester and you went to school at St. Bonaventure, right?
Yeah, so I went to St. Bonaventure. I was really into music, and I was running a radio station there. And my college girlfriend at the time, she took me to the Rock Hall as like a graduation present. And I fell in love with it, but it was really out of sight, out of mind for several years while I was working in Rochester. I was still covering music, but I really didn't care about the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame all that much. Mm-hmm. And then I got the job here in Cleveland, and they asked me, I think it was a couple months in, I was covering local music really, and my boss was like, we want to send you to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame ceremony. This is the 2014 ceremony, but we can't afford a hotel for you. But my best friend, he lives in New York, so I said I could stay at his place. And from that point on, they said, okay, you're going to cover everything that has to do with the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, from the inductions to what's going on at the museum.
Okay. So that's really where the passion project came for you at that point, or was that just sort of elevated from your initial visit after college?
I think, I was always into all, music. I'm obsessed with all kinds of music. I think that just gave me this platform. It was like, okay, you're going to pay me to cover the greatest artists of all time, cover the museum that honors them. It just gave me it opened up this world for me to be able to put my passion for music that I've always had since I was a kid, listening to my parents' records, to what I was paid to do, to my employment.
Nice. So what is you mentioned earlier that you follow like all aspects of music, all genres. Is now that you're sort of like following the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame a lot more closely, is there sort of like a personal passion project that you would sort of like an artist that you think has long since been snubbed that you think really deserves to be in? Or was there one that finally got in that made you so happy?
I think Janet Jackson was the one, in the sense that, I'm a huge fan of Janet Jackson, as well as several other artists that have gotten in. But she, to me, really embodied the problems with the Rock Hall induction in terms of being a woman and being a person of color. I think those were two things that the Rock Hall was lacking in. And I couldn't believe her being, she's a pop artist, but, we could discuss the definition of rock and roll if you want. But I think that it blew me away that you have someone who's one of the 10 to 15 biggest pop stars of all time taking 2-3 chances, attempts to get inducted into the Rock Hall. And then the other person, I would say, is probably Craftwork, just because that would open the floodgates for a genre that I think is deserving of more consideration moving forward, especially when you're given today's mainstream music landscape.
It's sort of coincidental that you bring up Craftwork. That's sort of mine that I feel very, very passionate about, that they have been long since overdue for the Rock Hall, although I can think of 4 people who probably couldn't even care less if they ever got in or not.
No, I think that to give the nominating committee credit, which I'm not always quick to do for obvious reasons.
Right.
They have done their job in terms of nominating Craftwork several times. The same thing with Chic, who I thought belonged in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Mm-hmm.
But the voters, and then that just turns your attention to, some problems I think that the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame has with its voter base.
I had a conversation not that long ago with Evelyn McDonald, who's now a voter and a rock and roll critic and a professor out west. And one of her biggest issues that she's always had is that there's certainly an underrepresentation of women in the Rock Hall. I agree with her, but then at the same time, when they're doing that on a basic mathematical basis, how it's like 8%, or actually it's under 8% in, yes, that's true, but when there's so many male bands that are in, it sort of conflates that. So I've always sort of been troubled when an article might come out and mention that, but then it won't really say why that is.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough because, look, when you start with this, I'm just going to go off the top of my head. I haven't done the math, but I'm going to guess that artists that peaked in the 60s make up the biggest decade of Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Mm-hmm.
Then the 50s and 70s are probably very close and moving forward. But when you get into those early years, rock and roll music, the majority of people participating in it are men. And you're right. The percentages still aren't great if you just kind of say, okay, well, Heart, that's a female act. So if you go by that realm, because there's more male members in Joan Jett and the Blackhearts or Heart than female members, but they're fronted by women. But the percentages aren't great. And then I like to stick more to, for me personally, the women that aren't in, as opposed to the level of some of the men that wind up getting in.
Mm-hmm. So now that Janet's in, is there a woman that you'd like to see inducted? Like what would be the next person or the next female that you think is long deserving? I
mean, Tina Turner's in with Ike, which I don't have a problem with that. Ike Turner, obviously, everybody has this image of Ike Turner from the movie, the biopic, and the things that happened between him and Tina. Ike and Tina deserves to be in a Rock Hall. Ike earned his place, very influential figure in rock and roll. But Tina Turner's solo career from the 1980s, early 80s on, really tremendous, such a great comeback story. I'd like to see her honored individually for both the fact that she doesn't have to have her Rock Hall induction connected to a man who clearly that marriage didn't go the way that she would have hoped, but also just to honor that solo career that was huge. I mean, she's one of the biggest stars of that decade. So I would say Tina Turner, but also, Carole King. I'm kind of torn on Carole King because a lot of people cite her as a huge snub, and obviously from a performance standpoint, I think she should be in. But then I think some people suggest that she somehow prefers being a songwriter first. So I don't know. I mean, I've never spoken with her about it. So, but she would be on my list.
Yeah, Tina Turner for me, actually for my regular co-host on my weekly Hall of Fame show, he's a huge advocate of getting Turner in there as a solo. Actually, my favorite album of Tina's was actually not what she did in the 80s, but it was Acid Queen, just of all these rock covers in the 70s.
Yeah, I mean, she had a tremendous career, and Ike and Tina I think you have a situation where Tina Turner was solo and Ike and Tina was led from a visionary standpoint from Ike. Mm-hmm. They're very distinct acts, so I think they should be inducted as opposed to something like, if you take Tina Turner's solo career and put it up against Jeff Beck, who's in as a solo artist and also in with the Yardbirds. I mean, what are we talking about here? No offense to Jeff Beck, one of the great guitar players, but solo material.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Have the influence.
Yeah. I totally agree with you. There's a lot of sort of head scratchers annually, and you did give some credit to the committee, and one thing I will say that they always seem to strive to do is come up with a list of nominees that really run the gamut of musical genres.
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily have a problem with the committee's list every year. I just wish there was more transparency to what they're doing.
Totally.
Because they're trying to put together a collection of artists that, the voters can vote on. But I have a lot, if the committee's really doing its job, I look to something like the fan vote. If they're going to go through all these hoops of, let's partner with Google and all that crap, just put the winner of the fan vote in. Because technically speaking, if the committee's doing its job, every artist they nominate is worthy of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
I think, last year was the first time that the fan vote didn't get in? So in the 6 years that they've been doing it. Yeah, Dave Matthews dominated the fan vote, and that was the first time since they did the fan vote that Dave Matthews didn't get in. And I think it was disingenuous by the nominating committee. I think, I'm not sure they were all on board with Dave Matthews getting in, and I think they knew the voters weren't going to vote Dave Matthews Band in, but I think they knew the fans were going to get excited, so they kind of manipulated them into getting some buzz for the nominations, in my opinion. Yeah, and I'm totally agree with you in terms of transparency on that, because when I did talk to Evelyn about that, who again is now a voter, I asked her how many voters are there. She had no idea. So we don't even know who the voters are
at this point, man. They probably send in ballots to people who are dead, and somebody's secretary gets to fill it out or something. They don't. The Rockwell they don't know. They just mail this crap out. There's people who have theories, because there's no transparency in this process, that they don't actually count the votes. And while as ridiculous as you want to think that is, we don't really have any evidence to refute that other than their word, because this isn't the Baseball Hall of Fame where writers openly, you could poll writers and see who they voted for, at least a large number of them, so that we know the percentages that everyone got in the end. We don't even get that. So what do we know? Who had the most votes? Who didn't get any votes? We don't know.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, the only time I ever heard of any kind of vote tabulation was, and that somehow got leaked, and they were really upset about that, was when Jan Wenner flipped the 5th and 6th spot because he felt and
the Grandmaster flag.
Yes, yeah, and it was one of those things too where I totally agree with him that Grandmaster was a more worthy inductee than the Dave Clark 5, but then either you're Democratic or you're not.
Yeah, I mean, and how many times do they do that? Because 1 year it's 5, the next year it's 6, and they're like, well, 5 and 6 were very close. Okay, so you tell us. Mm-hmm. I don't really know. I find it's not easy to have a conspiracy theory. Do we really think that? Who's getting in this year? You got do we really think T-Rex got more votes than Pat Benatar? And look, I'm all for T-Rex being in, but based on who voters have voted for in recent years, that's hard to believe. That's shocking almost.
Oh yeah, I would have bet a paycheck that Benatar was a lock, and they even the way they nominated her, because if they thought that she wasn't, because she didn't write her material, that was mostly done with her husband and writing partner, but he was on that ballot too. So I thought they covered all bases so that it was a lock for her to get in. And then when she didn't,
it's all very it's very suspicious. I think about Radiohead, right? They didn't get in on the first try, and you figure they're no brainer. But then I'm like, okay, they openly said, Tom York openly said he couldn't care less, and then they don't get in. And I'm thinking, do the voters really care if he said that, or is there some backdoor stuff let's put these guys off? Let's not, there's no transparency, so we don't know.
Right. And that's something I've always sort of been critical about some of the sports halls, but when the baseball hall, like you said, that's certainly got its share of problems with its voting process, blows you away in terms of how what the process is. That's kind of a problem.
Yeah, I think the Baseball Hall of Fame, I mean, you could take it. What I like about the Baseball Hall of Fame is that, you know who's voting. It's the writers. The percentages in the end of who's voted for. Mm-hmm. And most importantly, I think that the Rock Hall could do is the limit on eligibility.
That's actually something. Sorry, go ahead. I interrupted you. Well, okay. Well, I was going to say that Because my weekly co-host and I actually he came up with this one idea of just sort of mimicking what other sports halls do, and then you just create your senior category at this point. Because there are some artists from the 50s and the 60s that are possibly worthy of a look, but they're kind of bounced off now from more recent acts who would sort of qualify. But yeah, I mean, just a simple tweak in that I think could add a few artists that have sort of fallen off the wayside. Like Big Mama Thornton comes to mind, who could still
they have their they have their early influencers category where they can consider some of X, but if they would have done it from the beginning, where it was okay, you could be on the ballot for 10 years, 15 years after the year you're eligible. It would have condensed things down. It's hard when you get a ballot that has, the Notorious B.I.G. and, an act from the 1970s. How are you comparing that? And a lot of times it's these acts that they never even been nominated before, like a Journey or ELO or Chicago, like all these artists. Whether you think they're in or they should get in or not, they get in on their first nomination. It makes you wonder, like, what was the holdup?
And I think we're going to see that again. There's quite a few other big name artists. I think like once Jethro Tull finally gets a nomination, I think they're going to walk right in.
Well, there's plenty of them. Jethro Tull, King Crimson. I mean, there's you can go down a list of 70s acts that if they got nominated, it was like the Bon Jovi thing, and then you read it was the Jan Wenner biography that he just didn't want him in. He's like, what did Bon Jovi do? And whether he's right or not, just this one guy who decides, let's not even put him on the ballot because they suck. But you knew at that point when Bon Jovi was nominated or the Journeys of the world, like whether it's the first or second time, they're going to get in. But you're right. Jethro Tull, probably like a half the acts on your first couple pages of your site probably get in if they were ever nominated right away.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, you said the same thing about Kiss too. Like Kiss is one of those love-hate bands for me. I love going to a Kiss concert, and I've been to many. Whenever I put my critical hat on, it's not like I'm thinking that they really changed the musical world.
Yeah, I mean, Kiss is an interesting act. I think that kind of leads over to the voters, whereas I think, Rush was a little bit more critically friendly by the point they got nominated. I'm torn on Kiss. Somebody asked a question, can you tell the story of rock and roll when you're talking about this artist? Mm-hmm. Which is kind of a ridiculous question anyway. But it's like I guess you could work around any artist, but, other than Chuck Berry or something like that. Kiss. Yeah, I'm okay with Kiss being in, though.
No, I totally am too. It's one of those bands, but like you said, if Kiss never existed, I don't think that music world would have changed one bit. Having said that, how many people picked up a guitar and then got influenced by something, but because of Kiss, but then they got influenced by something else? I think Tom Morello of Rage Against the Machine sort of talked a bit about that.
Yeah, there's people who would tell you, he's very passionate about Kiss being an integral part of influence on him, but Rage Against the Machine's music doesn't sound like Kiss, of course. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I don't know. It's not an exact science. It's not numbers based like sports is to some degree. But I do think there are obvious artists whose influence was just so tremendous that them sitting on the sidelines is just ridiculous compared to some of the other acts that are getting in.
Mm-hmm. So you've mentioned the baseball hall quite a bit. You also cover some sports for Cleveland.com?
We kind of do sports, anything lifestyle and culture. So in terms of sports culture, whether it relates to the TV culture, sports analysts, sneakers, we like to do some merchandise. I somehow wound up doing, MMA and Ultimate Fighting for Cleveland.com, just off of me being the most familiar with it in the office when Stipe Miocic, who's from here, won the heavyweight championship. So yeah, we dabble in other things as well. music, TV, and movies. It's been so music heavy lately, though. It was kind of divided up a little more, but it's really been mostly music now.
Mm-hmm. And you're now sort of branching out with your own podcast that I'm really excited to hear about. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, it's called Cle Rocks, and it's, the tagline is the music podcast from the birthplace of rock and roll. Alan Freed came up with the term rock and roll, where the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame exists. And really, we're just looking at the moments and the people who shaped rock and roll, past and present. We're opening up the podcast, launching it, if you will, with 3 episodes, interviews with Nils Lofgren of E Street Band, Ace Frehley of Kiss, and John Oates of Hall & Oates. Those will be the first 3 podcasts, so just interviews with those guys and their thoughts on their current projects, their big projects, and I think for each of them, we did get a take on their Hall inductions, what they remember about the ceremonies, and as you might imagine, Ace Frehley's is priceless.
I can't wait to listen to that.
It's just funny because the publicists, you get these publicists who are like, he doesn't really like talking about Kiss. Nobody told Ace Frehley that, because you ask him about Kiss, he'll talk about Kiss. So yeah, that was the most interesting. Everybody else was pretty lighthearted, but Ace Frehley just gave 0 F's. It's like he even got into the All-Star Jam that was supposed to happen at that ceremony and why it didn't happen and what was supposed to happen. It's pretty crazy. He was really good.
And when will that be dropping?
That the first 3 episodes launch September 24th, so Thursday, September 24th. And then we'll have them every Thursday. We'll have an episode every Thursday after that.
All right, that is awesome. Troy, thanks so much for being part of this. I love these conversations, and hopefully we'll be able to do this again in the future.
Yeah, anytime, man. Just let me know. It's great. It's great. A lot of fun.
All right, thanks so much. Thank you so much for listening. Stay safe, everybody. Look for new content on the regular at notinhalloffame.com.